Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about Jeff Bezos. In particular, we're going to talk about his vision for space exploration and space colonization. So, his name obviously is known to everyone for his work with Amazon, but what's a little bit less talked about perhaps is his work with his space exploration company, Blue Origin. And he recently appeared on a podcast, and I started to see articles about the podcast, that I hadn't watched it at the time. And the thing that kept on coming up was that Jeff Bezos apparently said, I would love to see trillions of people living in the solar system. And so that statement was kind of the subject of some articles that were kind of poking fun at the concept, but I wanted to know what he was talking about. And it turned out that recently I actually read a book about this topic called The High Frontier by a man named Gerard K. O'Neill. And he is the originator of the concept of the what's now called the O'Neill Space Colony. And it turns out that Jeff Bezos is a big fan. So we're going to actually talk about the broader context of what it would mean for trillions of people to live in the solar system. We're going to talk about a little bit about the technological vision behind such an idea. And I think we're going to have fun, in particular, talking about the pros and cons of that vision. I think this vision is particularly interesting when you think about it as kind of like the contrasting visions of two space exploring billionaires. So obviously we hear a lot about Elon Musk and his shenanigans and his vision and the work that he's doing towards space exploration. And I'm a huge fan of SpaceX and everything they've been doing. But Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos' company, is really talked about a lot. There is the third company, which is that's kind of run by a space exploring billionaire, Virgin Galactic. I don't really know as much about them, and I don't have a sense of that particular. I think it's Richard Branson. I don't really have a sense of what his vision is, but it's very interesting because if you look at Elon Musk and you look at Jeff Bezos from the perspective of space exploration, they really do kind of envision or embody the goals of two very distinct perspectives that you see developed a lot in science fiction. So Elon Musk is a huge fan of the concept of terraforming, and that's been really explored a lot. A lot of thought experiments, a lot of pretty good books about terraforming Mars and what that might look like. And then Jeff, on the other hand, is really pursuing this idea of the O'Neill space colony. And so there's very two distinct visions, and hopefully we can get a sense of like, what are the mid term and the long term vision for those two different perspectives. So the O'Neill space colony, let's just talk about the basic idea. So usually it's envisioned as a giant cylinder in space. There are different geometries which are talked about, but the simplest to understand is just a cylinder, which you can see in this picture. And the idea is that the cylinder would be able to rotate on its axis, and that is going to give you a sense of gravity from rotation. And the idea is that you will actually live on the interior surface of the cylinder, and the rotation will give you the gravity that you need to sort of perform your normal physiological functions. One thing that became clear in the early days of the moon missions and just early space exploration is that humans don't function all that well under low gravity or in free fall conditions. We can live like that for a while, but the longer you spend under those conditions, your health really starts to deteriorate. So if you're gonna spend a long time in space, like maybe like live out your whole life in space, you're gonna need some way to get that gravity. That's either gonna come from living on a planetary body, or it's gonna come from probably living in a rotating cylinder of some kind. Another key feature of the O'Neill Space Colony, and you can see in this artist rendition, is solar panels. Like, presumably you could have as many solar panels as you want. You can also see that this particular design is envisioned to have windows, so you could get direct sunlight coming in. Obviously, that would need to be filtered pretty heavily so you don't get damaged by the intensity of the radiation. And the goal is that you could make these big enough that you could have most functions of planetary life, that you could have farming and everything else that you needed to do. What's very interesting in the book is that, obviously the first type of space cylinders or space colonies that we would make would have to not be all that huge. But O'Neill's long-term vision is that you could make these space colonies as big as you wanted. And he even explores the idea eventually of having space colonies that have, the surface area, or like the livable surface area, the size of a small country. So I think he brought up Denmark, as his example of a smaller sized country. But picture like a small to mid-sized country or state if you live in the US, and that's actually, you have that much living space in a single colony. And in terms of where you get the material, the idea is that you would probably mine most of your materials from the moon or from the asteroid belt and, other planetary bodies like that. So as I said before, this originated with this guy, Gerard K. O'Neill, and he really summarized his ideas in this book, The High Frontier, which was written in 1977. So O'Neill was a physicist. He was also an inventor. He did a lot of more like mainstream, very solid, good science. And this stuff is not like his sole legacy. Like I said, he invented some pretty good stuff. But this is kind of more like his intellectual legacy apart from his primary work as a physicist. What's really interesting is that when I was looking at the, sort of like historical context of the publication of this book and O'Neill's speaking tour that came with it, is that this was actually considered, in hindsight, something of a public relations disaster. This idea that we would live in these cylinders up in space was considered to be so far out there that it actually alienated many people from the concept of, some of what NASA's budget was being spent on. Actually, I want to read a quote from this guy. There was a senator, William Proxmire, was the chairman of the Senate subcommittee responsible for NASA's budget. And he was not really a big fan of the size of NASA's budget at the time. And he's quoted to have said, "It's the best argument yet for chopping NASA's funding to the bone. I say not a penny for this nutty fantasy." So, and it says, this is from the Wikipedia article, it says he successfully eliminated spending on space colonization research from the NASA budget. But to be fair, it is, pretty crazy, right? It's not necessarily ludicrous to call this a nutty fantasy. But we'll talk about some of the pros and cons, and then I'd love to hear from you whether or not this actually is a nutty fantasy, or whether that's, something we could do someday. So in terms of the pros of this vision, right, and let's think about this primarily compared to the vision, like Elon Musk's vision that we're going to colonize other planets like Mars. The first pro is that you arguably have something approaching infinite energy. So when you are outside of an atmosphere, the quality of the solar energy that you get can be significantly higher. Because it's not being filtered out by the atmosphere. In addition to that, there's really no limit to space, to the amount of real estate you have access to. In addition to that, if you can imagine this is sort of like unlocking an infinite energy function. Is if you can get all of your material for making your solar panels from space, which is to say, from the moon or from asteroids and things like that. And you can supply all the manufacturing energy needed from your existing solar panels in space, and you can employ robotics, you kind of have arguably infinite energy, because your robots are making more solar panels and they're using solar energy to power that activity, and you can just envision making more and more solar panels. And so a scenario where we're out in the solar system living in space stations is one in which solar energy is virtually or practically unlimited, if provided we develop our space manufacturing technology further. Another really attractive aspect of the space colony concept is that it gives people room to grow. And so you can see, here's a picture. This is an artist's rendition of a terraformed Mars. So this is Mars with oceans, and this one doesn't have a whole lot of green, but long term, I think that you can envision that if you really did a good job with your terraforming, that someday maybe Mars could be covered in forests, right? And cities and things like that. But with the high frontier, which is to say space, the space itself, not just a planet, there's no practical limits. You could envision making a cylinder the size of a small country, right? Like we've talked about that. But why can't you make a million of them given enough time? Let's say several thousand years in the future. There's no particular reason. If you can make one, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to make thousands more. And that means no population control, no overcrowding. And, to borrow Jeff's phrase again, he said, I would love to see 1 trillion people in the solar system, because that means 1,000 Einsteins and 1,000 Mozarts. So he's thinking about, the extremes of the bell curve, right? Where you have people of exceptional genius, the type of person who's only 1 in 1 million, right? Well, how do you get more people who are 1 in 1 million? One way is you educate them better, right? And so that's definitely a worthy endeavor. But the other thing is, if you just have more people, then logically you'll have more geniuses, more Einsteins, more Mozarts, the type of person who is able to, move the human race forward more than just marginally, who's able to help us make a big leap forward. So getting back to the main topic, another pro of the space station model is the concept of customized environments. And this relates to like NIMBY or not in my backyard. And so in these pictures, you can see these are some, artist renditions of different things you can do. On the left, we have the farming in the space station. And on the right, you can see that this would be like a manufacturing hub. Maybe there's manufacturing going on an asteroid or something like that. But the point is that you have the possibility to take these different and arguably incompatible activities and actually put them thousands of miles away from each other, or just in completely different separate environments. And as long as your two space stations were kind of at the same sort of like gravitational context in the solar system, and they were moving at similar rates, the energy cost of commuting between the two space stations would be very, very low. So you could have your, you could have your farming community in one space station, and you could have your residential community in another, and you could have your heavy industry in another, and you would never have fumes, you would never have pollution to experience from these different things. And I think that's a pretty interesting idea. One of the most exciting pros with this model is that the argument is that the O'Neill space colony model would give you the ideal staging for interstellar travel. So if you can picture having these space stations that are outside of the gravity well of an individual planet, that means that it would be the ideal context to actually build a huge spaceship that would, have the capacity to actually travel to another solar system. And so for that reason, I think that the O'Neill space colony model actually does a better job of setting us up for the long-term vision of space exploration, which is actually leaving the solar system. So I do want to spend some time talking about the cons or the risks associated with this vision. And I want to start with talking about catastrophic failure. So this is actually, in my opinion, this is hilariously understated by O'Neill. And he does talk about it, but it's in chapter 7, Risks and Dangers. He says, almost every human activity carries with it some element of risk. Occasionally, in a rare, macabre frame of mind, I have reflected on the fact that at any time, almost every human being, however healthy, is within 1 or 2 minutes of death if the wrong combination of circumstances were to come to pass. I don't think that's a particularly compelling way to start the conversation about the risk of the high frontier. It's kind of like if you were getting on on an experimental airplane, and you asked the pilot, it's like, hey, is this risky? And their response is like, hey man, crossing the street is risky, right? It's like, I don't really need that. That doesn't actually like make me feel better. It's kind of like avoiding the point. And so he does talk a couple of different risks. He spends some time talking about the risk of meteoroids and meteors. And he does point out that the size of meteor that would be a threat to a space station is low enough that that's, kind of like a once in a million years thing, that you might get one that would actually be big enough that would really, really damage your space station. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm going to trust him on that. But he does spend some time on the other risks as well. He talks a little bit about war, and he, kind of says, "Hey, this isn't really my expertise," but he kind of he suggests that, or he hopes that many of the causes of war would be obviated by our move into space. For instance, like we wouldn't need to fight wars over territory anymore because, you would have plenty of space, right? There's no limit. And he does also mention terrorism, but again, he kind of understates that. He kind of says, well, we could scan people at customs. We could, make sure they didn't bring explosives with them and things like that. But I don't know. I mean, at some level, I think that if you're going to do something this wild and this different, first of all, there's going to be risks that you can't foresee. And as far as terrorism goes, I mean, I think that O'Neill he wrote this in 1977, and I don't think he properly understood just how ingenious people can be when they really set their minds to causing havoc. And so I think that the risk of catastrophic failure of a space station is probably a lot higher than that which is acknowledged by O'Neill. The second con is sort of the kind of a broad question. Would this really bring about stable or healthy ecosystems? And there's different ways to think about this. Like one is psychological. Like, is it psychologically feasible for a human being to live in a large cylinder in space? Like, is there something about us, like, do we need to live on a planet just for our mental health long term? Physically speaking, you think in terms of, pests and disease. Now, O'Neill also, he talks about kind of like the benefit he thought one of the benefits would be that we could build these space stations and we wouldn't have cockroaches and we wouldn't have disease, we wouldn't have blight. And I think he didn't have maybe a very good perspective of kind of the fact that human beings do not actually thrive in a sterile environment. Like we are actually the beneficiary of bacterial colonies and things like that. And so if you put human beings into any kind of environment long enough, you're going to see that like our biome, our bacterial populations will eventually spread out. I have to think that over time people would inadvertently import insects. And that's actually something that I've seen a few articles on with the International Space Station. And this was an article where they talk about some study where they took swabs of different surfaces in the ISS, and they found that, yeah, actually the International Space Station, despite being in space, is really, really full of bacteria and potentially disease-causing bacteria in some cases. The third con that I see with this concept is sort of like, broadly speaking, political risk. Now think about this. I think that, imagine that you are living in a space station. It's sort of like a combination of living in a country and living on a ship. And I have to think that certain sort of like political ideologies may become emergent just by virtue of survival necessity. So, for example, if there is a big risk of catastrophic failure, I could see tyrannies being very popular or very common, if only because of the context. Con number 4, and O'Neill doesn't talk about this much, but people might hate it, right? I do wonder about this, right? As human beings, is living on Earth your birthright? Is this something that you're born to? If you also think about 1 trillion people living in space, I can't remember how many people have ever lived. Like it's something like 100 billion. Like it's in that sort of ballpark. Because the population right now, we have I think 7 or 8 billion people on Earth, and just a couple generations ago it was just 1 or 2 billion. And before that, it was, not too long ago, several hundred years, I think there were 100 million people on the planet. And if you look at the fact that most of the people who have ever lived are either living now or have lived in the last 100 years, the total number of people who have ever lived is not that large. So let's say if we go out into, several hundred years, and there are on the order of, billions and maybe even a trillion people living in the solar system, that means that the vast majority of people who have ever lived at one point in the future may never have set foot on planet Earth. And that means that the human experience overall will have fundamentally changed. What if you never had the chance to feel the wind on your face? Right? What is that? What if that is just something that you could read about that your ancestors experienced? I don't really know if that's the good life. We talk a lot about how space in the future is going to be this utopia, but I'm not so sure that a future where you never feel the wind in your face or get to run across like the rolling hills of Earth, not that like I'm out doing that all the time, but I'm just saying where you never had the chance to do that. I don't know if that's a good future or not. So that's one of the cons I think about this vision. But how crazy is it? I mean, it's pretty crazy, right? It was called a nutty fantasy in the 70s. I will say O'Neill was a visionary. He was very optimistic. Honestly, he thought that a lot of this stuff would be done by now. Like if he knew that in 2024, people were still kind of mostly making fun of the idea, I think he would be pretty disappointed. And reading the book because it's so optimistic, it actually makes me sad for that reason. But I think it's a beautiful vision. I think there's a lot of challenges to it, but if you think about this concept, especially as a launch pad for interstellar travel, just going back to Jeff Bezos' words about the idea of a million Einsteins, a million Mozarts, a solar system, he says, full of life and energy. I think that's a beautiful idea. So thinking about, again, the vision of these two billionaires, you have Musk, you have Bezos, just thinking about their near term, midterm, and long term. There's stuff to like about what these guys are doing. There's plenty of stuff to not like. That's not what this video is about. Somebody else can make that video and probably very persuasively. But Elon Musk, near term, he's trying to, according to his words, and let's just take them at face value, he's trying to help the human race, and he's trying to help us achieve the vision of what we could be if we were everything that we could be. And so his near-term vision, he has SpaceX, where he's contracting with NASA, and he's building a spaceship to go to Mars. He's also helping to build solar panels and electric cars, which presumably will help us sort of maintain the health of our ecosystem. His midterm vision is settling Mars, and he's talked about having a million people on Mars. That's kind of what he views as sort of like an attainable vision. And long term, he does talk about interstellar civilization. He talks about being out there among the stars. There was an interesting podcast with Joe Rogan, and I don't remember which one it was, which episode, but the two of them were talking about the long-term vision, and Elon Musk said there's really, from his perspective, two possible visions for the long-term future. In one, we're out there among the stars, and we're exploring, and it's beautiful, and it's amazing. And in the other vision, the other option, we never do it. And he said there's something very, very sad about that. So that's Musk's overall perspective. But Bezos has the same long-term goal, but he just thinks we're going to go about it different. So near term, he's doing his Blue Origin, which is space tourism, and also is trying to set up the infrastructure for further space projects. And his podcast with Lex Friedman, which I will link below, does talk about that more. But his midterm vision is these space colonies with millions or more people and growing space infrastructure. And so I guess overall, I think that while Musk has a better near-term start on this, I think that Jeff Bezos' midterm vision, the space colony vision, is probably more compelling than terraforming Mars. That's just my point of view. I am really curious what you think. What do you think about the idea of space colonization? What do you think about the O'Neill space colonies? I imagine that some of you watching the video might know more about this topic than me, and I'd love to hear your perspectives. And just for those of you who the topic is new, I also am just curious, like, what's your gut reaction? Do you think a future where we're living in these presumably, hopefully beautiful space stations out in the solar system is a good one. Well, anyway, I want to thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll join me again soon. Bye.